The document was placed on the desk in the king's private study at Clarence House on a Tuesday morning. There was no fanfare. There was no ceremony. There was no gathering of advisors or senior royals or constitutional experts standing in a semicircle waiting for a signature. There was only Charles, alone, with a single set of papers, a pen given to him by his mother years before, and a decision that had been building inside him for longer than anyone outside the palace walls could possibly imagine. When he signed it, the sound of the pen on the page was the only sound in the room. And somewhere down the corridor, in a separate wing of the residence, Camilla was sitting with a cup of tea she would never finish, about to learn that the man she had spent decades fighting to stand beside had just made a decision that would reshape her place in the monarchy forever. She was not warned. She was not consulted. She was not given a courtesy heads-up by a senior aide or a gentle whisper from a trusted assistant. She found out the way the rest of the palace found out, through a sealed communication delivered by the Lord Chamberlain's office, the administrative body responsible for managing the royal household's most sensitive operations. And when she read it, she set the paper down on the table beside her unfinished tea, looked out the window toward the gardens she had walked through 1,000 times, and said nothing. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss a single update. What happened that morning was not a punishment. It was not a betrayal. It was not the act of a husband turning against his wife. But it felt like all of those things at once. Because the document Charles signed did something that no one in the modern history of the British monarchy had expected to see. It formally redefined the scope of Camilla's role as queen consort, not removed, not stripped, redefined, and the difference between those words was the difference between everything. To understand what that means, you have to understand what the role of queen consort actually entailed. A queen consort was the title given to the wife of a reigning king. She shared his social and ceremonial prominence, but not his political authority. She was crowned alongside him. She stood beside him at state events. She undertook patronages and public engagements. She was, in the eyes of the public, the female face of the monarchy, and for Camilla, that title had been hard-won. It had taken decades of public rehabilitation, years of careful image management, and a final blessing from Queen Elizabeth herself to transform a woman who had once been vilified across Britain into a figure of quiet acceptance. The public had slowly, grudgingly, and in many cases reluctantly come to tolerate her, and in recent months, some had even begun to warm to her. But behind the warmth, behind the carefully managed appearances and the smiling photographs, the institution had been watching, and what it saw had begun to cause concern. But to understand why, the story did not begin that morning. The decision was not born in a single moment. It was born in a series of moments, each one small enough to escape public attention, each one quietly noted by the people whose job it was to protect the crown from itself. The first incident occurred during a state visit. The details of a state visit involved weeks of preparation by the official household, the complex administrative machinery that managed every aspect of the royal family's public engagements. Every gesture, every seating arrangement, every word spoken at every dinner was choreographed with precision. And during this particular visit, Camilla made a request that fell outside the agreed protocol. She asked for her personal staff to be given expanded access to areas of the palace that were traditionally restricted to the sovereign's immediate team. The request was not unreasonable in her eyes. She wanted her people around her. She wanted the comfort of familiarity in an environment that had never fully felt like home. But to the palace staff who had served the institution for decades, it was a signal that the boundary between the queen consort's personal circle and the sovereign's official structure was beginning to blur. The request was quietly declined. No one told Charles. No one wanted to bother him with what seemed like a minor administrative matter. But the incident was recorded in the way that all such incidents were recorded inside the palace. Not on paper, in memory, in the quiet institutional awareness that accumulated like sediment at the bottom of a river, unseen but steadily altering the flow. The second incident came weeks later. Camilla had been expanding her public engagements, taking on more patronages, accepting more invitations. gradually increasing her visibility in ways that, on the surface, seemed perfectly aligned with her role. But beneath the surface, her office had begun operating with a degree of independence that concerned the senior advisors who reported directly to the king. Decisions were being made without coordination with the sovereign's team. Appearances were being scheduled without the standard clearance process. Statements were being released through Camilla's personal channels that had not been reviewed by the Royal Communications Office. None of these actions were scandalous. None of them would have made a headline on their own. But together, they formed a pattern. And patterns, inside the palace, were the things that mattered, because the monarchy was not merely a family. It was an institution, and institutions did not survive on good intentions. They survived on structure, on the careful, often invisible alignment of every moving part. When one part began to move independently, the entire mechanism was at risk. The truth was more painful. Charles had been hearing the concerns for months, not from one source, from many, from the Lord Chamberlain, from the private secretary's office, from senior courtiers who had served his mother for decades and who viewed the crown with a reverence that bordered on the sacred. They were not telling him his wife was scheming. They were not suggesting disloyalty. They were telling him something more subtle and more difficult to hear. They were telling him that the structure was drifting, that the careful balance between the sovereign's authority and the queen consort's presence was tilting in a direction that, if left unaddressed, could create confusion about who spoke for the crown. And in a monarchy, confusion was not merely inconvenient, it was dangerous. Charles listened. He did not dismiss the concerns. He did not defend his wife reflexively. He did not tell the advisors they were overreacting. He did what he had always done when faced with information he did not want to accept. He sat with it. He carried it. He turned it over in the quiet hours of the evening when the palace was dark, and the only sound was the creak of an old building that had witnessed centuries of decisions just like this one. And slowly, over weeks, the weight of those concerns began to settle into something that resembled resolve. Not the resolve of a king acting against his queen, the resolve of a sovereign acting to protect the institution he had been born to serve. The confrontation that followed was not a shouting match. It was not a scene from a film. It was a conversation that took place in their private apartments, late in the evening, after the staff had withdrawn and the building had gone quiet. Charles told Camilla what he was going to do. He did not ask for permission. He did not present it as a negotiation. He told her, with the careful, measured tone of a man who had spent months preparing for this moment, that he was going to sign a document that would formally clarify the boundaries of her role. The document would specify that her authority as queen consort was ceremonial and supportive, not operational, that her office would be integrated more closely with the sovereign's official household, that certain decisions regarding public engagements, communications, and staffing would require coordination with the king's private secretary, that her personal staff would operate within the existing palace structure rather than as an independent unit. It was not a demotion, it was a clarification. But clarification, when you are the one being clarified, feels exactly like a demotion. Camilla listened. She sat very still. She did not interrupt. She did not cry. She did not leave the room. No one raised their voice, but the silence in that room carried a weight that no argument could have matched. When Charles finished, she asked one question, just one. She asked him whether this was about the institution or about them, whether he was making this decision as a king protecting his crown or as a husband pulling away from his wife. And Charles, who had spent a lifetime navigating the impossible space between duty and love, who had watched his first marriage collapse under the exact same tension, who had seen what happened when a king tried to serve both his heart and his throne and failed at both, looked at her and said something that was either the most honest or the most painful thing he had ever said to the woman he loved. He said it was about the institution, and it was about them, because the two could no longer be separated, because the institution was them, because every decision he made about the crown was a decision about their life together, and every decision about their life together was a decision about the crown. He could not protect one without hurting the other. He could not serve the monarchy without placing limits on the woman he had fought the world to marry. And he could not love her fully without allowing that love to complicate the structure that held the monarchy together. He had expected concern. He had not expected the look he saw on her face. It was not fury. It was not shock. It was recognition. The recognition of a woman who had always known, somewhere beneath the surface, that this day would come, because she had lived inside the institution long enough to understand its rules. She knew that the crown consumed everything it touched. She knew that the institution did not make room for independent power. She knew that the same system that had given her the title of Queen Consort could, at any moment, redefine what that title meant. She had simply hoped, in the quiet and private way that people hope when they know better, that it would not happen during Charles's reign, that it would wait, that the adjustment would come later, under William, when the transition to a new reign would naturally reshape every role. But Charles had decided not to wait, and that was what left her speechless. Not the content of the decision, the timing. The fact that the man who had spent decades defying convention to be with her had chosen, now, in the middle of his own reign, to place the institution between them. The institutional machinery moved quickly after that. The Lord Chamberlain's office prepared the formal documentation. The King's private secretary drafted the operational guidelines. The communications team developed a strategy for managing any public reaction. Everything was handled with the kind of seamless, invisible efficiency that the palace had perfected over centuries of managing crises far larger than this one. The official household was the administrative body that coordinated the royal family's day-to-day operations, and within its walls, the adjustment was treated not as a dramatic event, but as a routine recalibration. Staff were briefed, protocols were updated, schedules were realigned, and through it all, Camilla's public appearances continued without interruption. She attended the engagements on her calendar. She smiled at the cameras. She wore the brooches and the hats and the expressions that the public had come to recognize as her version of royal composure. But those who worked closely with her noticed the change. It was not in what she said. It was in what she did not say. The small opinions she used to offer during planning meetings were no longer offered. The gentle suggestions she used to make about public engagements were no longer made. She was present. She was performing. But she had begun to withdraw into the space that the new boundaries had created, the space that said, clearly and without malice, that her role was to support, not to shape. The leak came 3 weeks later, not through a press release, not through an official announcement, through a source inside the palace who spoke to a senior reporter at one of Britain's most influential newspapers, not to expose a scandal, but to share a shift. The story broke on a Sunday morning. The headline did not use the word demotion. It did not use the word punishment. It used the word redefinition. And that word, clinical and precise, was enough to send the British public into a frenzy of speculation. Broadcasters picked up the story within hours. Political commentators debated the constitutional implications. Royal analysts dissected every word of the report, searching for clues about what had really happened behind the palace walls. Social media erupted with theories. Some said Charles was preparing the ground for William's future reign. Some said Camilla had overstepped and been corrected. Some said the marriage was in crisis. Some said this was simply the natural evolution of a monarchy finding its footing under a new king. The palace issued no denial, no confirmation, no clarification. The silence was deliberate, because silence in the royal household was not absence. It was strategy. It allowed the story to breathe without being fed. It allowed the public to speculate without the institution being drawn into a public conversation about a private decision. And it allowed Charles to maintain the one thing that mattered more than public opinion: control. The country saw one thing. Inside the family, the truth was far more painful. William had been informed before the document was signed. Not because Charles needed his approval, because Charles needed his understanding. The Prince of Wales was the future. Every decision made in the present reign cast a shadow into the next one. And if William did not understand the reasoning behind the redefinition of Camilla's role, that shadow would darken into something that could fracture the family long after Charles was gone. Charles called his son to a private meeting at Windsor. Not a formal audience, not a scheduled briefing. A conversation between a father and a son who would one day inherit everything he was now deciding. He explained the concerns. He explained the pattern. He explained the decision. And he asked William to trust him. William listened carefully. He asked precise, measured questions. He did not challenge the decision. He did not defend Camilla. He did not take sides in the way that sides are taken in families where love and power are tangled together in ways that no constitution can untangle. He asked his father one thing. He asked whether Camilla knew. Charles said she did. William asked whether she had accepted it. Charles paused. Then he said she had not spoken since he told her. That pause told William everything he needed to know. Because William understood, perhaps better than anyone, what it meant to love someone inside the walls of an institution that did not recognize love as a valid basis for decision-making. He had watched his mother die inside those walls. He had watched his father spend decades fighting to build a life inside them. He had built his own marriage within them, carefully, deliberately, with a precision that came from having seen what happened when precision was abandoned. And he knew that his father's decision, however necessary it was from an institutional perspective, had cost something that no document could quantify. Catherine had been told by William that evening. She listened in the quiet way she always listened to palace matters, absorbing the information without reaction, processing it in the private space behind her composed exterior. She understood the institutional logic. She understood the need for clarity. But she also understood something that the advisors and the courtiers and the constitutional experts did not. She understood that Camilla had not been trying to build a separate power base. She had been trying to build a home. Inside a palace that had never felt like one. Inside an institution that had spent decades telling her she did not belong. Inside a family that had tolerated her presence long before it accepted her place. The expansion of her staff, the independence of her office, the uncoordinated appearances, all of it was not a grab for power. It was an attempt to create a sense of control over a life that had been defined, for as long as she could remember, by the decisions of others. And now, even that small sense of control was being gently, respectfully, and irreversibly taken away. The silence deepened. In the days that followed, the family continued its public duties. Charles and Camilla appeared together at a reception. They stood by side, they smiled, they performed the choreography of a royal couple with the same practiced ease they had displayed for years. But those who had followed the story closely, those who had read the reports and heard the speculation and understood the institutional currents beneath the surface, watched their body language with a new intensity. And what they saw was subtle but unmistakable. Camilla was still beside Charles, but she was no longer leaning in. She was upright, composed, self-contained, as if the invisible cord that had connected her to the king's orbit had been loosened by a single degree, not severed, loosened. Charles, for his part, maintained his usual demeanor. He was gracious. He was attentive. He turned toward her at the appropriate moments. He included her in conversations. He performed every gesture that protocol and affection demanded. But there was something in his eyes that had not been there before. Something that looked like the weight of a man who had chosen, once again, to put the crown ahead of his heart, and who knew that this time the heart might not forgive him as quickly. The monarchy could survive many things, but not the slow erosion of trust between the people at its center. And Charles knew this. He knew it the way he knew the names of every room in every palace he had ever lived in. Instinctively, completely, without needing to be told. That was why the decision had been so agonizing. Not because the institutional concerns were complex. They were straightforward. The pattern was clear. The solution was logical. What was agonizing was the knowledge that the solution, however correct, would land on the woman he loved as a message that said her instincts were wrong, that her attempts to build comfort were destabilizing, that her presence, however welcome, needed to be managed, that the institution she had finally been accepted into would always, always reserve the right to tell her where she stood, and that she would have to accept it. Not because she agreed, but because the alternative was a confrontation that neither she nor the monarchy could afford. Yet the story was not over, because institutions do not have feelings, but people do. And the people inside the institution were still navigating the aftermath of a decision that had been made on paper, but was being lived in flesh and blood. In the weeks that followed, a quiet reconciliation began to take shape, not a dramatic one, not a moment of tearful embrace or sudden forgiveness. A slow, careful process of recalibration between two people who had spent their entire relationship navigating the impossible space between private love and public duty. Charles began to make small adjustments, not to the document. The document was signed. The operational changes were in place. The institutional structure had been recalibrated. What he adjusted was the human dimension. He made sure Camilla was included in the planning of future state events, not as a figurehead, but as a voice. He ensured that her patronages and charitable work received the same level of institutional support as before. He asked for her input on matters that the document did not require him to ask about. These were not reversals of the decision. They were compensations. Quiet acts of recognition from a king who understood that while the institution needed structure, the woman beside him needed to know that the structure was not a wall between them. And Camilla, in her own way, began to respond, not with words, not with gratitude expressed openly, but with a gradual return to the version of herself that had earned the public's grudging respect in the first place. The version that did not seek the spotlight, but did not shrink from duty. The version that understood that her role had always been, in its essence, to support the crown without becoming a weight upon it. She resumed her engagements with a renewed focus. She continued her work with the charities she had championed for years. She appeared beside Charles at public events with the same composure she had always carried, but now with a clearer understanding of where the lines were drawn. And in that clarity, something unexpected happened. She found a kind of peace, not the peace of victory, not the peace of getting what she wanted, the peace of knowing exactly where she stood, because ambiguity, for a woman who had spent decades in the gray zone between mistress and wife, between outsider and insider, between public scorn and public acceptance, had always been the enemy. And now, for the first time, the ambiguity was gone. The rules were clear, the boundaries were defined, her role was specified. And within those boundaries, she could operate without the constant fear of overstepping, without the quiet anxiety of not knowing where the line was, without the suspicion that every decision she made was being silently evaluated against a standard she could not see. The document had given her something that all the titles and all the acceptance in the world had not: certainty. And certainty, inside an institution built on centuries of tradition and protocol and invisible rules, was its own form of power. The public reaction settled into a quiet consensus. The initial storm of speculation faded. The headlines moved on to other stories. The broadcasters found new topics to dissect, and what remained was a subtle, gradual shift in the way Camilla was perceived, not diminished, clarified. She was seen, perhaps for the first time, not as a woman who had fought her way into the monarchy through love and controversy, but as a figure who had been given a defined role within an ancient system and who had accepted that role with a dignity that surprised even her critics. The final symbolic moment came on a quiet afternoon at Windsor. Charles and Camilla were seen walking through the gardens. No cameras had been arranged. No press had been notified. It was a private moment, glimpsed from a distance by a single photographer who captured it without intrusion. In the photograph, Charles was walking slightly ahead. Camilla was a step behind, not because protocol demanded it, because the path was narrow and she had let him go first. And as they walked, Charles turned back, not fully, just enough to make sure she was there, just enough to extend his hand behind him, without looking, in a gesture so natural and so small that it could mean everything or nothing. Camilla took his hand, and they continued walking, together, in the same direction. Through the same garden they had walked through 100 times before, but now with a clearer understanding of what it meant to walk together inside an institution that would always, always place its own survival above the comfort of the people inside it. The monarchy chose clarity over ambiguity that day. It chose structure over sentiment. It chose the future over the comfort of the present. And in doing so, it did not destroy a marriage. It did not break a family. It did not humiliate a queen. It simply acknowledged what had always been true. That love, inside the walls of a palace, is never enough. That duty will always ask more than affection can give. That the crown, however heavy, must be carried with hands that are free of entanglement. And that the people who choose to serve it must accept, with whatever grace they can summon, that the institution will never love them back. Charles had made his decision. Camilla had received it. And the monarchy, that ancient and improbable institution that had survived centuries of upheaval by bending without breaking, had absorbed one more fracture into its stone. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but with the quiet, stubborn endurance that had kept it standing for 1,000 years. The family remained wounded but intact. The crown remained heavy but held, and the woman who had been left speechless on a Tuesday morning in a corridor at Clarence House had found, in the silence that followed, something she had been searching for her entire life inside the palace. Not the freedom to be whatever she wanted, the certainty of knowing exactly what she was. Thanks for watching. Please do not forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.